Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Maybe Midrash. This is a month-long reading event that I'm hosting along with Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse and Felicia at Little Prairie Library, in which we throw a spotlight on and celebrate the mingling of all kinds of religious themes and textures with literature and even with film. And the ambit of the event is as wide as that admixture. That admixture is, as you know, is everywhere. You can hardly turn a page of a book without encountering at least some reflection of the religious faiths that have girded Western society and Eastern society forever. And it was Jason's idea to put that front and center for a bit, not to proselytize or to condemn, but rather just to tip the hat to the enormous debt that the one owes the other. So we've been doing read-alongs, and it's been lots of fun to watch all the people that have jumped on board, and all the different ways that they are finding religion reflected in what they read, what they're choosing to read for the month. And for me, I am doing read-alongs of two different books, one fiction, one nonfiction. For the first 2 weeks of May, I am talking about this, Joseph Heller's novel God Knows, which is a punky, rhetorically daring fictional retelling of the story of David from the Hebrew Bible. And as David himself points out in God Knows, he has the best story in the Bible. It's full of not just great set pieces, but human drama, human pathos. And we read the first half of this last week. We're finishing it up. We're finishing up the novel today. And the second half of God Knows tells more of the story of David. Joseph Heller goes into great detail, so that almost I've recommended this to people who thought that the second half almost required them to have a Bible dictionary out and open in front of them, or maybe to do some brushing up ahead of time on the different parts of David's story. Everybody knows some parts of that story. David and Goliath, of course, has passed into the realm of cliche, and there are a couple of other stories, sending a man to the front lines where he's sure to die so that you can claim his wife, that sort of thing. David is not portrayed in the Old Testament as a pure hero. He is the most three-dimensional character, I say, the most three-dimensional character in any ancient literature. But there's a lot more to his story than just those signpost moments, and they are the meat of the second half of this book. And Joseph Heller reflects on that. He reflects that fact by very often having his characters resort to King James diction. Thou hast, thou goest, that sort of thing. It's the book, it sticks out like a sore thumb because he's writing the rest of the book in a very New York contemporary idiom. David and Bathsheba and all the other characters talk like characters from a Woody Allen movie most of the time. They shift into that King James idiom only when the narrative directly intersects with the bright spotlight of sacred text. And only then, ironically, only then to comment on it just a bit, to underscore how human the characters are the rest of the time. And that happens a lot more often in the second half of the book than the first half, which led a lot of critics at the time and a lot of readers of this book since to say that it's only half effective, that Heller sort of loses the creative thrust of the first half of the book as he gets bogged down in his research for the second half. I don't believe that's true. I think that there's a tremendous, tremendous power in this book from start to finish, mainly because Heller has conceived ahead of time what he wants his David to be. And his David is a bitterly disappointed man for filial reasons. For filial reasons. He is not as disappointed as other writers have had him be for instance, regnal reasons. The tribulations of his throne, however he got it, however he keeps it, however he's going to dispose of it, don't weigh on him nearly so much as the tribulations of being both a son and a father. And that puts, God Knows, squarely in the incredibly rich tradition of Jewish American fiction, which is always obsessed with those two aspects of the filial relationship. The thing I love most about this book is that it broadens those things. David's relationship with his actual blood father is barely mentioned. It's barely touched on at all. Instead, the father figure that we get on Earth is King Saul. And the father figure that we get overriding everything else is God himself. And the relationship between David and King Saul in this book takes time to unpack. I've read this many times, and I don't think I've got to the bottom of it. It's been a joy to reread it from maybe Midrash. And I want to give you just a taste of that at one point when David is reflecting on Saul, who he increasingly believes as the book goes on was driven insane by David's popularity, which is certainly a reading that you can do from the Old Testament. That is not doing violence to the book at all. That maybe his ambition, David's ambition, which he can no more forsake than he can his own arms and legs, was the thing that unseated Saul's reason. Because he tells us, as far as anyone knows, Saul had no history of emotional instability prior to the day that Samuel anointed me. And that eats at David. He is brash, and even now we're encountering him in this book at the end of his life. He's brash and he's monumentally sure of himself, but even so, this subject eats at him. And he writes, how I loved that man Saul. How I looked up to him even when he drove me away and hunted me. How I yearned to be sealed into his embrace and taken into his household as a member of his family. That never happened. He meant more to me than God. I still have dreams about Saul. I have never in my life had a dream about God. My dreams of Saul are of longing, remorse, and reconciliation. When they sent to fetch me to cure him, I walked from Bethlehem to Gibeah, and as though every step were on hallowed ground. I went barefoot. His mission seemed holy. For much of the way I felt out of breath from awe. He was Saul, the famous. I was going to meet him. He was my Lord, the King. He was the savior of Israel, the military leader who had routed Jabesh Gilead and the besieging Ammonites for his first big victory, and had trounced the Philistines for his next. And now he was feeling low. Irony of ironies, said the preacher, that I, the unwitting cause of his disease, was called upon to supply the remedy. I wanted to call him Father. I did call him Father. Each time I addressed him as my Lord and King, I was calling him Father. Each time he answered, he called me his son. In the years I was near him, I wanted to hug him. In the years I was distant, I wanted to be back. He was impassive in affection and kept me at bay. He said he would make me his armor-bearer and then forgot to. He said he would always remember me and didn't. He said I would be to him always as one of his own sons. Had I known at the time how he felt about his children, this would have been cause for concern. That note runs throughout, and it's not present in any of the rest of what Joseph Heller wrote. This is the only book of his where he dares that sort of thing. All the rest of his major novels are comedic, pretty much from start to finish. And they have, don't get me wrong, they're not shallow. They have strong undertones, very good, very sharp insights on human nature, but not that longing, not that sense of emotional vulnerability. That's only in this book. And it grows in the second half of the book. It gets stronger as David recounts more and more of his story. I want to read you one more excerpt here. It's just a very brief thing, but this is a note that is struck throughout. Yes, we have that passage I just read is the perfect evocation of his relationship with Saul. But there's also the relationship he has with God. And that comes up over and over again because of an incident that you can read in the Old Testament where God strikes a baby son of David's dead to teach him a lesson about faith and fidelity. And although the books in which David appears in the Hebrew Bible aren't big on internal psychologizing, so that if you read it quickly you can think that loss rolls off David, in this book it most certainly does not. In this book it has caused a rift between David and God that will not be healed until God apologizes. And David knows that's not going to happen. He says here, I imagine that God himself frequently wants to feel like a king. Why else would he create the world? He did us a favor? But if it's up to me, he won't feel like a king again soon, not until I get my apology. I won't settle for that. What would it hurt him to apologize? Quote, David, I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking when I murdered your baby. Forgive me. Yes, murdered is the word. When the good Lord made my baby die in order to have me repent my sin, that was murder, wasn't it? God is a murderer. Imagine that. I told you I had the best story in the Bible, didn't I? I have always known that he was. Sooner or later he murders us all, doesn't he? And back we go to the dust from which we came. So I'm no longer scared to defy him. All he can do is kill me. That is, you can hear the plaintiveness there, that is not David sure of himself. That is David reassuring himself, trying to convince himself that his characterization of God is just. And of course, that characterization is mocked throughout the book because God is completely silent, completely, maddeningly silent. And we get to the end that way. We get to the end of David's story. We get to him as an old man. He cannot be made warm. He has a new concubine, Abishag, and she cannot warm him. She is the soul of solicitude, brings him anything he asks for, but she cannot banish the cold from his old body. And we get the final part of the book here that is just. I often talk on my BookTube channel about the artistry of ending a book and how it eludes most writers. And sometimes writer gets it right, and other times, boy, they nail it just perfectly. The ending of God Knows has haunted me since the minute I read it. It is almost night again. The skies of the desert are turning brown. In the pools of lamplight smoldering in the shadows, in the far corner of my room, I watch a vision slowly take shape. I see an eager, bright-eyed youth there on a low wooden stool. Then one bare knee of his is bent to the ground, and he is holding in his lap a lyre with 8 strings. The apparition has come to play for me. He is ruddy and withal of goodly countenance. Notice the King James terminology there, withal of goodly countenance. He is ruddy and withal of goodly countenance, and very pleasant to look at. His neck is as a tower of ivory. His locks are bushy and black as a raven, and his head is as most fine gold. I know him, of course, and thrill at the instant of recognition, at the sight of such a healthy, vibrant, expectant beauty in a face that is mine. I can hardly wait for more. He starts with a song I used to know in a clear, pure voice, too sweet for a girl's and too young for a man's. His music is soothing, almost divine. I have never been so happy as when I hear him begin. And then I look around me for a javelin to hurl at his head. David has become Saul. And you don't see it coming. And then I look around me for a javelin to hurl at his head. Abishag, my angel, has risen from her chair and approaches without noise, wearing only a vivid scarf. Her eyes are as dark as the tents of Kedar. I want my God back, and they send me a girl. There is nothing anywhere else in Joe Heller that matches the power of this book. And it works on me still, even after all this time and all these rereadings. So it was a pleasure to reread this for maybe Midrash. And that is the first half of the month, for me, is fiction. But for the second half of the month, we're going to do nonfiction. We're going to do this. We're going to read The Day the Revolution Began by N.T. Wright. And very helpfully, this book is split into 4 parts. So we're going to read the first 2 parts for next weekend, when we will reconvene for maybe Midrash again. So those of you who might have this book and might want to read along, it isn't a requirement. I will talk about it anyway. But if you might have it and you might want to read it, we'll read the first 2 parts for next weekend and talk all about it then. So we'll be switching to nonfiction. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.